Greetings all, Ferrari Man 601 here. Welcome back to another 1/18th scale model car review of this, rendered in 1/18th scale by Mattel Hot Wheels in their Elite line, the Ferrari F2001. Ferrari F2001, it is actually one of my favorite Ferrari Formula One cars of all time. For no reason other than I remember it from a video game that I played ad nauseum in my misguided and rather wasted youth. A youth which enabled me to remember all of these useless facts about Formula One cars. But I digress. The F2001, it is an absolute favorite of mine, and for good reason. Apart from my personal connection to playing the Formula One 2001 Studio Liverpool video game, it is the car with which Ferrari competed in the 2001 Formula One World Championship, and it is a car that won a World Championship in the drivers and constructors categories for my favorite team. Therefore, it has to be one of the favorites simply by default, does it not? I'm going to stick with that story. 20 races entered, 10 race victories. It is one of the greatest of all time in terms of hit rate, in terms of races entered versus races won. But beyond that, it represents an inflection point in Ferrari design language as far as I'm concerned, as far as the Formula One effort is concerned, because this was 2001. It was really the first year of the 21st century, and as we will discuss, it represents the last of a design trend of Ferrari Formula One cars, in my opinion, going back to 1996 and the Ferrari F310. But we'll get into that as time goes on with this review. The F2001 by Mattel Hot Wheels Elite. It's a great 1/18th scale model, and of course, it is a great race car to remember as well. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at the race history, the technical history, and of course, the characteristics of this wonderful 1/18th scale model by Mattel Hot Wheels Elite.
The Ferrari F2001. Ultimately, I suppose I would consider this car to be a very confident and competent expression of an acceptance of a new era of dominance. In so many words, Ferrari understood that with this design they had finally gotten the recipe absolutely right, and they were now going to herald a new era of victories upon victories in the Formula One World Championship. Having returned to the top of the world as a constructor in 1999 in a hard-fought battle with McLaren for that year's Constructors' Championship, and then backing that up in 2000 with the Constructors' Championship again and the Drivers' Championship for Michael Schumacher, 2001 was going to be a big year for Ferrari because a team winning one Constructors' Championship is a big accomplishment. A team winning one Drivers' Championship and then following up their previous year's Constructors' Championship with another title, that's a very big accomplishment and always indicative of a team that is working extremely well. However, going 3 for 3 in the Constructors and then trying to defend a Drivers' title on top of it, that is no mean feat, and very few teams manage to do something like that. So, in designing the F2001, Ferrari needed to be aggressive, but they also needed to be conservative, because going back to 1997 through 1999 with some cars that were designed for transitional regulatory years, 1998 going for grooved slick tires instead of true slick tires and narrowing the cars down, and 1999 being an evolutionary design thereof, you had 2 years of radical regulation changes that very much changed the fundamental nature of how the cars were working, and Ferrari rose to the occasion on that. 2000 and 2001, though, very much evolutionary years in terms of the regulations. Minor changes in terms of things like front wing heights had to be adapted for, and the F2001 does adapt for that. Also, though, we had the reintroduction of traction control in Formula One. The teams had been using it under the table for quite a while by this point, but the FIA finally relented in trying to police it in vain, and therefore the teams could formally, officially, in the open, use systems such as traction control once again. So, the F2001 being a slight change in overall design to account for those changes in regulatory environment, but for the most part, we're talking about carrying over things that worked and slowly pushing forward on things that we know could be improved. The F2001 therefore turned out to be one of the most reliable and one of the most setup compliant Formula One cars that Ferrari have ever made. The drivers loved this car, and even today, now that there are several F2001s that are still running in private ownership, The people who have gotten to drive these cars say that they are very nicely balanced. They're very neutral and even somewhat biased to understeer, which is very friendly for a relative novice. If you are someone who is fortunate enough to be in Ferrari's Corse Clienti program and you get the opportunity to drive one of these, the drivers have said, even the civilian drivers who aren't professional racing drivers say that this car is a very nice one to drive. So Ferrari absolutely got something right when they penned the F2001. What is the F2001 though, aside from being the car with which Ferrari competed in the 2001 and part of the 2002 Formula One World Championships? It is a single-seat Formula One car. We have got a legendary V10 engine in the back, and it is the premier level of design of the first decade of the 21st century as far as Ferrari were concerned. Heading up the Ferrari design office in designing and producing this car, some very familiar names. The team was led by team principal Jean Todt, and on the commercial side for Fiat and Ferrari we had Luca di Montezemolo. However, Rory Byrne, credited as chief designer on this car, under the tutelage of Ross Brawn as chief technical director overall for the Formula One team. So yet another collaboration between Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne, two legendary designers. Both men have World Championship winning Formula One designs to their name. When they joined forces, they truly were an unbeatable force. Such was the case here on the F2001. Ignazio Lunetta, head of R&D for Ferrari in this era as well. Aldo Costa, chief chassis designer in terms of how are we actually constructing the thing with the carbon and all of that. Marco Fainello, head of vehicle dynamics. Nicolas Tombasis, head aerodynamicist. James Allison, chief aerodynamicist, and Paolo Martinelli, the head of the engine design for Ferrari in this era. So an illustrious team of designers and fabricators working on this car's initial designs and then of course supervising its operation through the balance of the years in which it competed. Absolutely tremendous. It was immediately preceded by the F1 2000 from the 2000 season, with which it shares quite a lot of design traits as well as running gear in terms of gearbox design, more or less suspension design, and the engine of course is a derived form of the V10s that were in the F1 2000. The car was immediately succeeded by the Ferrari F2002 for the 2002 championship, and that car represents a bit more of a fundamental departure from this overall design. Therefore, I would say that the F2001 is the last of the 90s era Ferrari designs, even though of course it is a car that was only designed beginning in the mid to late stages of the year 2000. It is a 21st century car. It is quite evocative of designs of yesteryear, even from that perspective in that era for Ferrari. So I would say that this is the last of the run of Ferrari Formula One cars that began with the F310 in 1996. You can see traits on that car that are still on this one, versus when you look at the F2002, you don't really see so many F2001 things on it anymore, but you do see things on, say, F2007 that are evocative of F2002. So we're at an endpoint, in my assessment, of Ferrari Formula One design in this era here. A 2001 car, what do we see on it? Even though something from 2001 nowadays sounds like it's almost ancient, depending on how old you are. However, we have got carbon fiber galore, as you would expect, still in a modern Formula One car. We have got carbon fiber honeycomb composite structures making up the monocoque. That includes the cockpit area, your front suspension mounting points, your front wing mounting points, and of course the crash structures to absorb energy in the event of something going wrong, all in the name of protecting the driver. Also the fuel tank and engine mounting to that monocoque as well. So it's the structural core of the car. It's carbon today, and it was carbon in this era as well. Suspension design, front and rear. Double wishbone push rod on this car. We were not playing with pull rod in this era. Teams prototyped these things, sometimes on the 4-post test rig, and even sometimes on the test track. But they did not run these things in anger in terms of pull rod suspensions in this era. So double wishbone push rod it is, front and rear, on F2001. Overall length on the car, 4,460 millimeters or 176 inches. The width is 1,800 millimeters or 71 inches. That is homologated in the regulations. The height is 1,100 millimeters or 43 inches. Again, basically homologated in the regulations. What was powering this car? What was producing that glorious noise and that wonderful horsepower? It was the Ferrari Type 050. It was a 3-liter naturally aspirated V10 engine mounted longitudinally to the back of that fuel tank, which in turn was mounted right behind the cockpit there. The fuel tank, engine, and gearbox creating the second structural spine of the car, mating with the monocoque, and then your gearbox and rear suspension mating to the engine and fuel tank. So you've got that structural spine comprising the monocoque and then the driveline as a stressed member. And this is something that goes all the way back to the mid-1960s with Colin Chapman. So again, some things never really change in Formula One because they're still doing that to a large extent today. So that 3-liter V10 engine, a 90-degree bank angle on that thing, revving to some dizzy speeds around 17.5 to 18,000 RPM in this era. That engine was running through a 7-speed semi-automatic gearbox, paddle-controlled via those rocker switches on the back of the steering wheel, just like you see today, but only 7 forward ratios in this era. Of course, there was a reverse gear as well, as required by law. You had the differential mounted inside the gearbox as part of the gearbox casing, running through half shafts out to the rear axle, just like you see today. This car, rear-wheel drive exclusively, just like the modern Formula One cars, although not even a figment of a hybrid system in this era. Overall power figures on this thing, a little bit murky in terms of what you would have been getting in period. Nowadays, with these cars that do still run, they're detuned a little bit for reliability, just because maintenance on something like this, although not nearly as prohibitive as a more modern car, still fairly cost prohibitive. So they detune these engines a little bit. They don't quite rev them out as much. So nowadays, I would say you could expect to see around 650 to 700 horsepower if you see one of these cars running in a Corsa Chianti session, for example. But in the day, over 800 horsepower without a doubt, probably around 820 to 830 if I had to be a betting man. Overall weight on the car, 600 kilograms, or 1,323 pounds. That is significantly lighter than a modern Formula One car, and the car, of course, is significantly smaller than a modern Formula One car, so you'd expect a weight reduction, although bigger engine than a modern one by quite some margin. So what are we really doing nowadays with these super heavy cars? However, fuel provided by Shell, as are the lubricants, and you would see that via the prominent Shell branding on the side pods of F2001. Our brake system, just like we have today, we've got the carbon-carbon rotors and pads there. We've got calipers with multiple pistons in them, probably 4 to 6 pistons in the front. Very, very powerful brakes in this era, as well as in modern Formula One, but these brakes worked a little better thanks to the cars being a little bit lighter, but carbon, ceramic, carbon-carbon compounds for the brake systems. The wheels are a BBS magnesium, and they are wrapped in Bridgestone Potenza grooved slick tires, as were required by the regulatory environment of this time. 13-inch wheels, front and rear, on this car. Again, I think that is a more proper proportion for a Formula One car. The car was only raced by Ferrari in the 2001 and the beginning of the 2002 season, believe it or not. It was driven by Michael Schumacher and Rubens Barrichello. It made its debut at the 2001 Australian Grand Prix, which it won. And believe it or not, this car, it did compete for partially 2 seasons in Formula One. In 2002, running in the F2001B specification, it won the Australian Grand Prix again. So this is one of extremely few Formula One cars to win the same event in consecutive years. Very, very interesting and distinguishing statistic when we're talking about the history of the F2001. Overall, the car entered 20 races between 2001 and 2002. Out of those 20 entries, it won 10 of them, so bang on a 50% hit rate in terms of wins. It took 26 overall podium finishes, and yes, it took more podium positions than races entered because 2 cars entering a race, so you get 2 chances at a podium per event. 13 pole positions, and only 3 fastest laps. It was not the fastest car in the balance of its career, but it had good reliability, and it was very easy to set up. So the drivers were happy with it, and even if it didn't have the all-out fastest pace as far as the stopwatch is concerned, because the drivers were comfortable with it and because it was reliable, it could outrace its competition in many of the times in which it did try to race its competition. Formally, the car is credited with 2 Constructors and 2 Drivers' Championships, credited with 2001 and 2002 for both of those. Michael Schumacher winning the Drivers' Championship in 2001 and 2002, and of course Ferrari continuing their dominant run of Constructors' Championship wins going back from 1999. So one of few cars to win the same event in 2 consecutive years, one of few cars to be credited with 4 World Championship titles, 2 drivers and 2 constructors. Very interesting history on something like the F2001, and of course, it was a very interesting car in its own right. Stopping our rotation now and taking a closer look at the overall plan of F2001. What do we see on this car? Well, predominantly, we see a car that is very clean, really. When you compare particularly designs in the later 2000s, getting into 2007, 2008, and then really going crazy with a completely different set of regulations beginning in 2017, we saw aerodynamic appendages all over on Formula One cars. From the moment we started to get into the front wing and front nose assembly all the way to the back of the car at the gearbox casing and rear wing, there were just little flick-ups and turning vanes and winglets everywhere, just trying to exploit every last bit of energy from a given volume of air. Not at all the case on something like F2001. First of all, the very front of the car, this front end and this front nose and wing assembly, it looks almost crude to modern eyes. However, this was absolute state-of-the-art stuff in this era, as any design of any Formula One car endeavors to be. But, as we see here, just very simplistic, straight across wing, a very slight dip toward the center section of the wing. That was an attempt to exploit loopholes in the regulations about the wing height that were put in for 2001. The F2000, if you'll be familiar with that car, you will note that that car has a very high nose, and then the front wing is mounted as low as possible on much longer pylons than what we see here. The FIA said we want the noses to get a little bit lower and we want the front wings to get a little bit higher because we want to limit downforce. So that's what had to happen beginning in 2001, and all the teams made that adjustment. Ferrari deciding to split the difference and make the nose lower, but also try to limit the amount of space that exists between the front wing main plane and the ground, because the lower you can get the wing, the more efficient it's going to be. So they're splitting that difference there by lowering the chassis height slightly, as well as by lowering your nose tip. So that's where we get this swan neck droop nose from on F2001. Very distinctive, probably the most surefire way to distinguish this car from the F2000, because otherwise they do look quite similar in many regards. However, as we move rearward on the car, you can see here that we have got that double wishbone pushrod suspension, and you can see this little appendage coming down from the bottom of the monocoque and the front nose. That's the keel. So this is a single keel car, and that is simply an appendage that was there for mounting the lower wishbones of the front suspension. The carbon composites of this era didn't allow very acute angles in a lot of cases, so if you could just make a flat plane for that wishbone to exist in, you did, and you mounted it to a keel, and that's what we had here on F2001. We would see this all the way up to, I believe, the 248 F1 of 2006 by F2007 in the year 2007 Ferrari going zero keel. But keels were the name of the game for Formula One front suspension geometry in this era. As we move away from the front suspension, though, we start looking at the midsection and rear of the car. You can see that we have got side pods, as you would expect. However, they are pretty crude in terms of their shape. They're fairly boxy. They do start to curve inboard toward their rear areas, and you would expect that to try and funnel air toward the top side of the diffuser, but they're big. There's a lot of freeboard space between the reference plane here and the top of the side pod there. This is just straight across, and that's something that we just do not see anymore in Formula One design, but here on F2001. Other things that we don't see anymore really in Formula One design, we have got this little winglet up here, as well as this winglet just ahead of the rear tire, and that is trying to remove some of the high-speed, high-pressure flow from that rear tire, because that spinning mass hanging out in the airstream just creates a lot of turbulence and therefore drag. So we're trying to clean that up a little bit before it even gets to the rear tire, so we can cut down on drag and therefore take more advantage of the horsepower available to us. Rear wing, we've got ourselves just a straight across single main plane wing with a flap over top of that main plane, but straight across, no funny business going on here with the end fence profiles and no other duct work or anything like that associated with the rear wing. It is just very simple. There is a beam wing as well that we can't quite see right now from this angle, but we've got a beam wing underneath that rear wing, just adding structural rigidity to the wing itself, but also adding some aerodynamic downforce for the air coming off of the engine cover, which of course we will discuss in due course. But all in all, a relatively simple aerodynamic philosophy. The car just looks very sweet in terms of being quiet and clean with its overall aerodynamic profiles. And again, this is a very classic, very evocative shape for Formula One fans of my particular vintage, because this is what I remember from when I was learning the sport. And also, it's something that I should note that my first real exposure to Formula One in terms of being able to take my time and understand what this was actually involving this car in some respects. The Studio Liverpool video game, the PlayStation 2 video game, Formula One 2001. That was the first time that I had appreciable experience to Formula One and was able to understand what it is and learn the places that it visited throughout the course of the season and learn about the teams. And the F2001 was my favorite car to drive on that game because it was very nicely handling. And I remember, I think I went on to win the World Championship on maximum difficulty like 9 or 10 times in this car, so I definitely got my money's worth out of that game. But it was my first real foray into being educated on what Formula One was, and this was the car in the game that enabled me to do that, and I enjoyed it very much as a kid, and I always had an affinity for this car for that reason. Taking a look nose on here on F2001, what do we see? Well, first of all, we see that nose tip profile that we discussed earlier. This very nice shape just coming down to a nice blunt point, but a point nonetheless. And on F1 2000, this would have been pretty much straight up at the camera, so your nose height would have been about here rather than where it is here. So a significant lowering of that nose tip here for the 2001 regulations. Not all the teams did it in this particular manner of having this curve down to the nose tip, but the teams did all bring their nose tips down to pretty much the height that you see here. That was something that was homologated by the regulations, so they had to comply with that. However, what they didn't have to comply with, at least not entirely in the alleged spirit of the regulations, as we always love to talk about in Formula One, spirit of the law is not the law, which means the letter of the law is what you follow. And the letter of the law said, about here on these front wings, the leading edge profile, you see how it dips down toward the center. This is not something that the FIA had in mind. They had envisioned when they drafted these regulations that the front wing would just be one uniform profile straight across. They did not mention, though, explicitly, that the height of your end fences here had to be the height of the entire lateral cross-section of the wing, which meant that the teams, always pursuing aerodynamic efficiency, said, if the wing doesn't have to be uniform across its entire profile, why should we make it uniform? And therefore, most of the teams did not. Some of the teams, especially early on in the year, interpreting the regulations conservatively, they did have wings that were straight across their entire profile. Not Ferrari, though. That spoon profile that you see here, that's something that was on F2001 right from the beginning, and it remained on the car through the balance of the season, and it was even there in 2002 when the car did the first couple rounds of that championship as well. So that was something innovative. Again, the lower you can get a wing to the ground, the more efficiently it runs because you accelerate air through that gap between the bottom of the wing and the ground, and therefore, when you accelerate a flow, its pressure drops relative to an adjacent surface, which means you are generating downforce. Yes, and that's exactly what you want on a Formula One car. You want lots and lots of downforce. Pulling away from the front wing, though, where you can actually see here the very nice division of its various profiles, three-element front wing with the slot gaps in there, quite nice. But moving up toward the front suspension, you can see double wishbone push rod quite evidently visible there. One manufacturing fault on the model, though. You can see that we have got a somewhat bent push rod right here, which is unfortunately kind of spoiling the illusion here of this being a real car, but among other things. But that's something that's just been on this one since I've had it. And it's stable, it's not going anywhere, but it is bent and it is rather noticeable, and it just is what it is. I've long since come to accept it, but I do wish that it were straight, as the other one on the right-hand side of the car evidently is. But it's there. I know you would notice it, so I thought I would acknowledge it. Regardless, though, continuing to move up toward the cockpit area, this nose very nicely sloping up, as you can see. Here's our pitot array, where we are taking air pressure measurements, and then an antenna taking measurements and transmitting that telemetry back to the pits. Our air snorkel there, air intake for the engine, doubling as the roll structure, our T-bar camera on top, and either side of the snorkel you can see these little winglets there to the left and to the right. We are just conditioning flow a little bit around the driver's helmet so that we can cut turbulence out before the air heads to the rear wing. So remember, there would be a driver. His head would be about here in terms of height, so just below the snorkel inlet, and that roughly spherical shape of the helmet is going to create some turbulence. So those winglets there serving to clean that flow out before it goes to the rear wing, before it could create any sort of inconsistencies in flow to the rear wing, which is something you really do not want on a Formula One car. Rear wing efficiency and good flow to the rear wing, very important for overall stability on a Formula One car. But that's really what we can see from the front here on F2001. Other smaller details, the wing mirrors right here on either side, as well as the two flick-up winglets here on each side, just ahead of those rear tires. But very nice profile here from the front end as well. Taking a look from the right side of F2001, what do we see? Well, here's our chance really to take a look at how the car is actually working. What are we doing here from front to rear, from beginning to end as the air flows through this car? Well, moving over here toward the front end, we obviously have that nose profile and our front wing. You can see the front wing end fence. It's just not flat and straight across as you might expect in a car of this vintage, but no, we actually have some fairly complicated design going on here. We've got this auxiliary dive plane, first of all, which is nothing particularly special, but you can see that we have profiled the side of this end fence as well. Right where you see the T here, we start to have blister outboard away from the center line of the car, and what we're doing here is we are creating a vortex inboard of the wing to try and get a low pressure zone to get air to funnel inboard of the front suspension here through the front axle so that we can start to feed the barge boards in this section. So lots and lots of stuff going on here just with that front wing end fence, and it's all done with just the shape of the carbon composites, no winglets or anything. This overall shape, this three-dimensional profile, would have been dictated in the autoclave when they laid up the carbon cloth before they baked it in that big industrial pressure cooker there to solidify the shape and to give it its structural rigidity. So lots of great design there, but we're not doing it with ancillary winglets and things. We're just doing it with the shape of the carbon composites. Brilliant engineering and brilliant fabrication skills. Additionally, though, our front axle itself, you can see those magnesium wheels wrapped in the Bridgestone Potenza tires. Very nice detail on these wheels, as you can probably divine. See if we can get in a little bit closer to them. There we go. You can see there we've got many, many spokes in these wheels. We have also got the wheel nut in the center there with our safety pin toggle. That is the structure that's coming out directly towards us there. The mechanics would do up the wheel nut with the gun. They would pull the socket off, and then they would reach in and pull that stud, that toggle, and that would engage a ball race inside the wheel nut to stop it backing off in the event that it did start to loosen out on track. And we really didn't have too many incidents with loose wheels in this era because of these systems. They were very good. Additionally, on the inner flange of this wheel, you can see we have got our valve stem right here. That's for the Schrader valve for putting air in the tire. Absolutely fantastic to see, and these are little details that you will not get on the run-of-the-mill Mattel Formula One models. The Elite line, though, as this one is an example of, you do get that, and they did a very nice job on them. As we move toward the center section of the front end, here are our barge boards. Quite evocative of the designs that we would see later on cars like F2002, but not quite as large and not quite as sophisticated as the designs that we would later see. But what we do see, we have got very stereotypical primary barge board shape with its concave profile as we head outboard. Very, very nice. Painted in that same body color red as the rest of the car, though, so a little bit harder to see from a distance, but it is absolutely there, and it's working in a very similar manner as you would expect a barge board to work. But unlike other cars, unlike cars that would succeed this one, we do not have barge boards that are mounted further forward on the car. These are the barge boards. This is it. There's one set. So that's why, in my parlance, I have the distinction of primary barge boards, which would be these, and then I've got secondary or initial barge boards, which would be underneath the front suspension. We don't have any of that, though, on F2001, but the nomenclature sticks. So primary barge boards in this area. Additionally, though, we have got the T-tray as well as the little stay on the T-tray just to keep it from flexing up and down too much as the car's going around with varying degrees of aerodynamic load. Moving rearward toward the cockpit area and side pods, here we go. So, side pods, first of all, radiator inlet, we have very nicely sculpted chines almost moving toward the cockpit and then outboard to the outboard flank of the car there with the side pod. But very nice. Obviously, we're scooping up air as it passes really behind the barge board in this section. The bodywork is somewhat profiled here in a curving shape, so we're attaching flow from the front suspension into the side pod area, and it works quite well for that intake for obviously the gigantic radiators inside for cooling that engine. But additionally, you can see that we don't really have too much going on here in terms of aerodynamically shaping the side pods. Certainly not like on F2002, where the upper surface of the side pod was almost like an inverted airfoil. We don't see that here on F2001. We just see flat lines for the most part, just trying to be unencumbering to the airflow. We don't want to generate more drag than we need to. However, we do have a winglet right up here, as well as a winglet here ahead of the rear tire. The winglet with the Bridgestone logo on it, that's designed just to cut down on wake turbulence for the rear tire, so we're trying to starve some of the high-speed, high-pressure air from interfacing with the rear tire to begin with. We'll cut down on drag that way. And then this winglet here, we're doing two things. One, we are generating a little bit of auxiliary downforce with it, but we're also steering air toward the main plane of the rear wing. So, interesting there. We're trying to increase the rear wing's efficiency here at the midpoint of the car. Very interesting stuff. Cockpit area itself, really nothing to note in terms of anything unconventional. It is utterly conventional for this area, for this era of Formula One. There is your frontal roll structure, as minuscule as it is, your little windscreen, and then of course your primary roll structure integrating with the air intake snorkel for the engine. The cockpit surround, you can see the sides of the cockpit right here. That's it. Not much in terms of lateral protection for the driver's head and neck. Hans was a thing in some areas of motorsport in this era, but it was not a thing in Formula One. I think drivers were testing it out, but they were not racing it, and it was by no means compulsory. So this cockpit surround was effectively the only real safety measure for trying to restrain the driver's head in the cockpit, and it really didn't offer much in terms of protection. Formula One in particular got very lucky in this era in terms of not having catastrophic injuries to drivers. The worst injuries that I can recall, obviously we had the fatal accidents for Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger in 1994, Mika Hakkinen having a scary one in 1995 at Adelaide, which would have been fatal had he not had immediate care from trackside doctors, and Michael Schumacher himself breaking his leg in 1999. But in the Schumacher incident in particular, it was particularly lucky that he went into a tire barrier at the end of a gravel trap rather than into even a tire barrier at the end of asphalt runout, for example, because he lost a lot of momentum before he went into the wall, and the wall itself was softer than it would have been had it been, say, concrete or steel. However, a frontal impact like that was something that the Hans device was designed to guard against in terms of overextending the driver's neck to where you get that basilar skull fracture where the spinal column separates from the bottom of the skull, and that's where you got a lot of the fatal injuries in motorsport in general in this era. And Formula One was very lucky that we didn't have those sorts of incidents. Similarly lucky with the Mika Hakkinen type of incident where you had a lateral impact and you get a deflection to both sides and it just overextends the head and neck, and you get concussive injuries because of the brain moving around inside. Hans also designed to cut down on that lateral movement. The cockpit surrounds also designed to cut down on that lateral movement. We just didn't have it in this era. So I think Formula One got lucky having the cars outfitted in the way that they were in this era. We didn't have any fatalities or really major injuries since Ayrton Senna and Mika Hakkinen in 94 and 95. 2001, though, Luciano Borti, we had an incident at Spa where he tangled with Eddie Irvine at Blanchimont, and Borti went into the barrier there. It turned out to be career-ending as far as his high-level motorsport career, but Borti did make a recovery, and he went on to race in Brazil, where he was from. But we got lucky in this era, for sure. We absolutely did. And later on, we started to see the integration of devices like Hans, better seat belts, better cockpit surrounds, beginning in 2008. And nowadays, of course, we have got the Halo system that is protecting these drivers from really debris incursion. But in this era, 2001, we weren't really thinking along those lines. So it's remarkable to look at nowadays and say, we really did get lucky. However, moving back to the technical details of the design of the car, you can see on the engine cover, we have just got this gentle triangular sloping shape. This is, I would say, a stereotypical classic Formula One engine cover in this era. Not trying to do anything in terms of fins, shark fins, or otherwise, just doing its job, providing protection from the elements for the engine and driveline underneath there. You can see a shut line, and you can see representations of fasteners for holding that bodywork in place. But overall, very nicely done here, design-wise, and very nicely done detail-wise by Mattel. Finally, our rear wing, you can see that we have got some fastener details here, as well as the slots here where the pins would go in to hold the flap angles at given settings. Very nice details there from Mattel. And then just down here to our reference plane once again, as you can see. Reference plane, and then that goes all the way rearward on a car. The side pod freeboard space turns inboard, and we feed our diffuser through this gap right here, through that stereotypical proverbial empty space to play with. So very, very nice to see all of that here on F2001. So a lot of the design conventions that we started to see later on in this decade, you're obviously seeing them here, just being expressed in ways that are a little bit more crude, a little bit less finely developed, as you would expect with the overall march of progress in motorsport. Looking at the rear zone on F2001, what do we see? Well, we're seeing quite a bit going on here, but again, some very classic technologies that we don't see really anymore in Formula One, but things that were so very important in this era. First of all, you can see this rear wing. We just have a simple main plane structure and then a beam wing underneath with the big gap between the two for air to go through and generate a lot of that rear downforce with. What else do we see on our rear zone? Well, we see exhaust outlets at these 2 points each side. These are the periscope style exhausts that Ferrari pioneered in 1998 on the F300. Prior to this, the teams were exhausting basically straight out the back with tailpipes. We're not doing that anymore in this era, and we hadn't been doing that for quite some time. There were still a couple of teams in this era, namely McLaren and Minardi, who were running blown diffusers. They were exhausting their diffusers someplace in the diffuser tunnels. But you did not have that on the Ferraris since 1998. And the reason for that was, if we move the exhaust up topside where they are here, you have more possibilities in terms of where you can put that exhaust. Ferrari, quite obviously, choosing to blow the rear suspension and beam wing with this car here. And we can tell that they're doing this because, can you see here on the beam wing, we have got these gold stripes. These are actually meant to be representations of the witness mark heat stickers on the beam wing, and there are other ones on the rear suspension as well. Those stickers were designed to report and record the peak temperature exposed by whatever component that they were on. So whichever temperature readings they got represented the absolute highest temperatures that the component experienced, and therefore they could say, is it too much, is it too little, and we can go more? Because obviously carbon composites and even metal steel components, they're sensitive to ambient temperature. Their material properties can change with temperature, so we needed to make sure that they were staying within their design limits. So that's where the witness mark stickers come in. But They're there because we're shunting exhaust gases through these areas, and exhaust gases obviously are very, very hot. Formula One engines run hot to begin with, and the exhaust systems, well, quite often they were so hot that they were glowing bright orange, sometimes even when the cars were sitting at idle, and when they were running under load, they could glow translucent, so much so that they would almost appear to be blue or purple to the naked eye, and to cameras, the digital cameras in particular, seeing into the infrared, you could see through them. Such was the amount of heat energy going through them. So lots of heat to manage. Obviously, that's why the cars have so many cuts in them for cooling the radiators, but also we need to account for where we're shunting this heat through the car, and even where we're shunting it through the atmosphere. Hence, we've got these heat witness mark stickers here on the beam wing. Hence, we have got this heat-treated carbon here, top side of the engine cover, because the exhaust obviously is going to be suggested to attach itself here to the bodywork to go through the beam wing here, and then exhaust out the back. So that's where it's all coming from. These were things that were really important. Ferrari, they put a lot of investment into that periscope exhaust because they saw the implications of being able to blow a beam wing, being able to energize flow in between this gap between the beam wing and the rear wing main plane. So they invested in it heavily, therefore they were still using it, and they were using it to great effect, as the competition record of a car like F2001 belies. Also, though, what we see here, we see two things. One, rear rain light, as you would expect, which is a red lens on it, which is something unique to the Mattel Elite line. And also, we see our diffuser right through here. We've got a 3-level diffuser, so we have got our reference plane, step 1, and then step 2, for a total of 3 levels here, the center tunnel being that third element in there. Very similar to the diffusers that we would see later on in the decade, particularly 2002 through 2004. 2004, we had some of the biggest expansion zones on Formula One diffusers that we would see for quite some time, really up until 2008. But you can see the overall design here. Fairly jagged lines on it. We're not really being particularly organic in the way that we're allocating curved spaces here. So the air is sort of being funneled through or more so marshaled through this area. But later designs would see the diffusers start to open up a little bit more and take more advantage of some curved shapes here to try and cut down on more turbulence being generated in this section, because straight lines are generally not good when we're talking about fluid dynamics, because fluids don't abruptly change direction most of the time, so we want to be more gradual. But here, with the technology available in terms of the carbon composites and with the space available in terms of the design of the car, this is what they settled on, and it was still rather effective. Taking a look here at the left side of F2001, just for the sake of continuity, all of the same details that we were able to see on the right side are reproduced here on the left. The car is utterly symmetrical here as we see it. There are not even any little nacoducts or flick-ups or anything that are here on one side versus the other. Nope, all 100% identical from the front wing end fences all the way to the rear wing end fences. Nothing different to see, except for the colors of our wheel nuts. They were blue on the left-hand side. They're blue on the right-hand side. They are red here on the left-hand side, so you can see some distinction there. But other than that, all of the same details that were evident before remain evident here. But I just do like to appreciate this shape. It is so very, very nice. Just letting your eye follow all the curves. Very clean, very crisp, very classic, and very evocative of times gone by in Formula One. And also the livery on this thing. The car wears its colors so nicely. Obviously predominantly red, but we have got the white accents in strategic areas to imply the existence of a very well-moneyed cigarette company, who was the title sponsor of Ferrari in this era. And then, of course, the other auxiliary sponsor contingent. Very nice. It fit the car very nicely. Obviously, a red Ferrari with Shell logos on it is always going to be a winner in my book, and that's, of course, what this one is. It's very, very nicely done, even from a livery design standpoint. Going up freehand now on F2001, what do we see here? Well, first of all, here on the front wing, getting in a little bit more closely than we could before, and we actually do start to glean a little bit more detail here. Can you see right here, these two little chevron pattern winglets? These are little vortex generators here on the extreme outboard edge of the inboard profile. So this is very unique. This is something we do not see at all anymore in Formula One. And the only thing that I can gather that these are functioning to do is to create vortices to go through the front suspension to cut down on the drag and turbulence that may be generated by the front suspension elements, despite them being shrouded here in these aerodynamic fairings. You would not really take too much imagination to expect there to be some turbulence created by that front suspension. So I'm thinking that these little chevron winglets are designed just to create a little vortex to go through there and to try and just accelerate the flow through that area of the car just a little bit more, just to cut down on any drag that may be generated thereby. Additionally, though, we have got our brake cooling duct right here on the right front anyway. Obviously an identical one just out of sight here on the left front, but there that is as well, and we couldn't quite see that earlier. So very, very nice. Additionally, our front wing itself with our triple element main plane there with the slot gaps between the elements, that's very nicely done. Very nice sponsorship decals are visible here as well. In addition to the little one here right on the dive plane, that's cool. And then the larger one on the end fence, as we can see, but very nicely done. Additionally, there is our keel structure right in that section, just coming down here to mount the front suspension lower wishbones to it. Very, very nicely done. And that very nice shape of our front nose cone. I do like that, and again, very distinctive of the F2001. Additionally, you can see we have got our camera mount. It is a blank at the moment, but the FIA, the FOM, were at their discretion to tell the teams where they would run cameras, and this was one of the locations where they could run an onboard camera for the broadcast, so very nice. Nice decal work here on the nose cone as well, with all of our associated sponsorship logos and our Ferrari logo down there at the nose tip, and of course the number 1 was Schumacher had earned for his performance in the 2000 season. Very cool. Coming up to where the monocoque and the nose section meet, we have got quick release fasteners for mounting and demounting the nose, and then our antenna and pitot array, very nice there. You'll see that this aftmost antenna is a bit crooked. That's just something that exists on this model, but it's there, but it still doesn't look too bad, because maybe it took a chunk of, I don't know, clag or something from the track, so we can tell that story if we would like. But nice representation of the shut line where the nose cone mounts up with the chassis, and then of course the shut lines where that hatch is for accessing the pedal box and footwell. Cool. And our front suspension, as we took a look at, but nice carbon coverings over that. Very nice look to that. Nice glossy finish on those suspension elements as well. I do like that immensely. Getting into the sides of the monocoque proper with our barge board detail, there it is. You can see not too much going on in terms of complexity, but it is there. Very cool. And there's the stay linking it up to the reference plane there on the top of the floor. Looks marvelous. And then our cockpit area. Nice cockpit area on this car. No driver figure, of course, but we do have in his place a nicely modeled seat and seat belts. The buckles are all photo etched, and the belts themselves are fabric, so nice to see all of that there. We also have a steering wheel with separately applied paddles for clutch actuation and gear shift. You can also see the gold paint there in terms of the quick release fastener for the steering wheel, taking that on and off for ingress and egress. On the side of the monocoque there, you can see the homologation sticker there, 2001, the FIA logo. And then somebody's signature there, Chief Steward, probably saying, yes, the car is safe and meets all of the regulatory requirements to be able to race. Very, very cool. I like all of that. There is also your N for the marshalling clutch. Very nice to see there. And just very nice overall lines on this monocoque. It looks absolutely great. There, of course, are your mirrors. And then your cockpit surround with the pull tabs for removal. Very cool to see that detail as well. But lots to see inside this cockpit, and Mattel did a very nice job on this one. Very, very cool. Great to see all of that detail inside. Coming across the car, though, there is our roll structure and snorkel, top of the engine cover. And here are our exhausts, those periscope-style exhausts, and you can see now the witness mark stickers there on the beam wing. Looks very, very cool. And you can see some more of those on the rear suspension in addition. because that's, of course, where we're sending all of these very hot exhaust gases. So very cool to see all of that. And then, of course, your rear wing completing that proportion with your rear suspension and beam wing. Very, very cool. Like all of that immensely. Again, very, very nice job here in this Elite line with these Formula One models. Again, you got to remind yourself sometimes that you're looking at a Mattel, because there are just some things on these that aren't on some of the run-of-the-mill versions, and it really, really does make a difference. Really appreciate that extra steps in terms of making the details work. Looking into the cockpit now from the right side of the car, and you can see that we still have more things to see inside here. There we are. Steering wheel, different from what we would later see on cars like F2002 and beyond. A little bit more of a quadrilateral shape to it on the top section, but still curved at the bottom, but very different in terms of the overall layout of buttons and switches and little LCD screens. The car does have, let's see, it looks like we've got 3 LCD units on this steering wheel. But they're very small. They're just really numerical layouts rather than showing you any real imagery. But you would have that for probably your race position, numerical representation of engine RPM, and probably some water or oil temperatures depending on which mode you had selected. But you'd see all of that in there. Looks good enough, and it obviously gave the drivers more than enough information to use while they were in the car. But nicely applied stickers there to be able to see the things like shift lights and, of course, where your buttons and rotary switches are. There is also a track map in the center of that steering wheel. I can't quite 100% identify it, but I think it's Australia. Looks like it's the Albert Park circuit to me. I can't quite see it either by eye or on my camera's screen, but if you're able to divine which circuit that is, again, I believe it is Albert Park. But you may have a better angle here in this 4K video than I've got here as far as I'm concerned by eye in the moment. On the side here, we have got 2 details. They're very, very dark. They may not come out as well as I can see them by eye, but we have got the maker of the Alcantara lining that Ferrari lined their seats and cockpit bulkheads with. And then to the right and slightly above that, we have got our Ferrari chassis plate. So again, another great detail that Mattel Elite here did on these models. Very, very cool. You don't get that on the run-of-the-mill cars at all. But there it is, the Ferrari chassis plate. Very cool to see that stuff. And again, I hope it comes through at least somewhat on the video, because I cannot see it on my little screen at the moment. But we'll see in post if we can make that a little bit brighter if we have to. But very cool. Also, though, just great looks here at the shut lines and everything, and the paint and the decal work. It looks tremendous here on F2001. I love all the fasteners that we've got. I love the paint finish on this. It looks absolutely wonderful. It's held up very nicely over the years. There's our exhaust with our heat-treated areas of bodywork. Looks great. Looks absolutely great. And of course, Ferrari logo and Schumacher there on the snorkel. Very cool stuff. Very cool stuff indeed. Looks wonderful. Really does. No complaints from me at all regarding anything that's evident on this one. And the bottom side on F2001, what do we see here? Well, we do not have the wood look of the center legality plank, as you might be expecting to see, but we do have this nicely modeled appearance here of most of the under tray diffuser section, including in our expansion zone. We get back into the glossy carbon for the beam wing, though, so interesting to see that, but nice shapes here. Obviously, there's your front wing from the underside, as well as the keel, where our front suspension mounts to, and then the T-tray area with its stay and our barge boards. Very nice to see all of that. Center section of the car, devoid of anything. There's your Hot Wheels logo there toward the outboard side of the reference plane. A lot number visible there. And then, of course, we've got some more information. A little bit difficult to read due to contrast, but this reads as copyright 2001, Mattel, China, Ferrari F2001, licensed by Ferrari SPA. And there is one other thing underneath. 118, that's what that is. So obviously the scale dimensions. So cool, like all of that. And yeah, that's the underside of F2001. A little bit different from what we see on other Formula One models, even of this vintage, but very nicely put together. There is still something interesting to see even underneath in an area where you wouldn't normally be looking.
So there it was, rendered in 1/18th scale by Mattel Hot Wheels in their Elite line, the Ferrari F2001. What can I say? This is a very good model. It is definitely one of the better Mattel models that you can get your hands on if you're able to get your hands on this one. This particular example is number 226 of 5,555 for the entire world. This was done as part of a series of reissuance of some earlier cars that Mattel had made earlier on in the 2000s decade. This particular one is a 2006 copyright of the Ferrari F2001. Initially, they had produced these molds in 2001 for release late in 2001, early 2002, but they decided to dress them up a little bit and then re-release them in commemoration of the 5 world championships that Michael Schumacher won with Ferrari between the years 2000 and 2004. Hence, this is one of 5,555. So if you are able to get your hands on one of the cars in this series, and they span from the F1 2000 all the way up through the F 2004, definitely they are going to be quite desirable. But number 226 is still here with me, and it has been surviving quite nicely. Really, I don't have anything to criticize about the overall fit and finish of this model. It's produced very nicely. The construction is solid. The front wing is a little bit wobbly sometimes, but again, just handle with care as you would anyway, and it's not going to cause any problems. The only thing I will say, that left front suspension, the push rod, being bent a little bit, it's just a little bit too much of a bend for it to be not noticeable, so it is noticeable. It's stable, though. It's not broken. It's not moving. And it's not going to go anywhere in the over 10 years that I've had this model, so it's probably okay forevermore. But it just is something that detracts a little bit from the overall aesthetic presence of the car, and it's noticeable, and therefore I will note it. But otherwise, though, I like the additional upscaling that they've done detail-wise with the foil effects on the fastener details in a lot of areas of the car. I like the glossy carbon finish on areas like the suspension elements, and the beam wing looks absolutely great. And of course, the paint and the clear coat on this one are very nicely done as well. But that cockpit, absolutely what sets this car apart from other models in the Mattel Formula One lineup over the years. It doesn't have the driver in it, but you've got the fabric seat belts, you've got the photo-etched buckles, you've got that great steering wheel with decals on it that show display elements, the buttons and switches, the separately applied gear shift and clutch paddles. Everything looks absolutely great in that cockpit, just as it does elsewhere, pretty much everywhere else on the car. Therefore, this is an absolutely great model, and if you can find one available in private sales nowadays, definitely jump on it if it appears to be in good shape, because it is very nicely put together, and as you can see, it is quite the nice treat for the eyes. But there it was, the Ferrari F2001 in 1/18 scale by Mattel Hot Wheels Elite. Definitely one of my favorite Formula One models in terms of all the cars I've got in the collection. This is one that I do revisit from time to time, and it's always a joy to behold. It's put together very, very nicely, and there's always something for your eyes to fall on and to appreciate. I do hope that you have all enjoyed this one, though. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you all very, very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.